The Castlevania series is probably one of the most famous in all of Nintendo history. I've played just about all of them, and that's a feat on its own, considering there are more than 20 that I know of. I've enjoyed each one, except for Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. When I think about playing that one again, my head screams at me.
No, God!
I think it's natural my favorite's the first one I played, the original Castlevania on the NES. And I'm not alone. The game has sold over 1.5 million units to date, but I wanted to understand exactly why this game is so awesome, so memorable and loved across the globe. And it kicked off an entire dynasty that lasts to this day. But what's so special about Castlevania? Well, let's find out.
Nintendo video games.
Marry me with my money.
You could probably thank Netflix for helping bring Castlevania back to people's minds lately with their recent and totally awesome animated series that launched in 2017 and another that came out just last year. For a lot of us though, it didn't take a TV show to fall in love with Castlevania.
The man who'll kill Dracula.
Since the first game's release in 1987, there have been more than 20 others, and like I said, almost all of them are phenomenal. But in the first game, well, it's a big deal because it did so much right. It had incredibly immersive environments, it was super challenging, creative, and has fantastic replay value. To this day, musicians are remixing and reinterpreting the game's soundtrack, and with a storyline that's led to a slew of follow-up games since its launch, and no sign of stopping, that's pretty impressive. When the original Castlevania came to the NES, it brought players straight into Dracula's castle for the first time. It's pretty broadly considered to be one of the most difficult Nintendo games, and I can't disagree with that. There are some pretty frustrating mechanics that make it a little tougher than other platformers, but the environments, the wide variety of enemies and bosses to face, and incredible music basically made it an instant classic. You play this first game as Simon Belmont, the descendant of a long line of vampire hunters. Now, he might look kind of like the bee costume girl from the Blind Melon music video, but I assure you he is in fact a badass vampire killer. Evidently, Belmonts have been fighting Dracula every 100 years or so for as long as anyone can remember. It's a curse the family bears, but it's also one that makes it totally acceptable to walk around with a whip and a bag full of knives, so it's a trade-off in my eyes. But it's also a really cool idea that this lineage of vampire hunters were destined to chase and destroy the lord of all vampires endlessly throughout history and through countless generations. Now, unlike a lot of following Castlevania games, this first one doesn't go too far into the whole story of why the Belmonts are forever fighting Dracula, but it absolutely could, because that kind of story is a writer's dream. You have to keep in mind that the lore behind Castlevania as a series is one of the main reasons this game was so unique. Some absolutely incredible games came out the same year, including Mega Man and Final Fantasy, and yet 37 years later we're still seeing new stories being written based on the first Castlevania game. So it's fair to say there was enough in the story here to launch a dynasty, and that's pretty respectable. The game itself is broken up into 6 levels with 3 sections each, which you go through one at a time following a map. Not a great map, I'll admit. I don't think Amerigo Vespucci would have given it a gold star or anything, but it works well enough. Each level has its own collection of enemies to face, and its own unique design that gives you the feeling you're slowly climbing up to Dracula's tower, which is the whole reason you're playing. Now, when it comes to monsters, Castlevania outdid themselves, and it's one of the best parts of the game. You've got your run-of-the-mill zombies, a pretty wide array of skeletons, and a stupid amount of floating Medusa heads. You also have these hopping hunchbacks, which is a recurring theme they brought into a lot of other Castlevania games. They're easily the most annoying enemies in the game, in my opinion. But every stage has something new to face, and with just a few pixels to work with, somehow things feel fresh every time. And that's not to mention that aside from having new enemies to fight, each stage also has its own soundtrack, and the music is genuinely amazing. It's clear they put some real thought into this, and it's appreciated. For bosses, they brought in some really interesting monsters, many of which are related to classic horror flicks like Frankenstein and the Grim Reaper. Plus there's Medusa, a giant mummy, and they're all challenging and unique in their own way. I think that's a nice feature, because some of these early platformers just copy-pasted monsters and bosses with different colors, which gets old really quick. Honestly, nothing's really too monotonous about Castlevania at all. To get through all these challenges, you start off with 4 lives and 5 hearts, with hearts more or less being ammo for your second weapon. Those secondary weapons include a throwing knife, throwing axe, holy water, a clock that freezes time for a moment, and a holy cross that functions like a boomerang. Your main attack is a magical whip called the Vampire Killer. I always like it when people name their weapons.
What's this weapon's name, Private Pile?
Sir, the private's weapon's name is Charlene, sir.
As with a lot of games at the time, there are also little hidden secrets you can find to help you along. There are magic stones that boost your secondary weapon abilities a little, which is handy since your whip isn't useful in every situation. There are also golden jars to give you temporary invincibility, a shit ton of giant bags of money, and rosaries that kill all the monsters on the screen. Probably the most useful and most well-known hidden items are known as wall meat, or health-restoring pot roasts that you can find hidden in walls here and there. And why Dracula and his architect decided to put Mom's leftovers in the wall, I'll never really understand that, but it's useful, because our boy Simon dies pretty easily in this game. It is not just from getting hit by enemies, that part actually makes sense. Probably the most annoying method of death comes from falling, because not only are there holes to fall down basically everywhere in Castlevania, but also because when you get hit, you fly backward a little. So there are plenty of times where some hopping hunchback or a flying skull will hit you and knock you down a pit to your instant death out of nowhere. All that said, even the annoying little moments are taking place in an incredibly immersive environment. Despite the graphics being dated, each level's rich with detail, the colors and designs are endlessly interesting, and you never run out of something new to see. But once you make your way through the castle, you'll face Dracula himself, and there are 2 phases to the fight. The first one's pretty easy, but it's totally a trap, because his second form is a lot more difficult. It's beatable, I can say that, but it's no easy feat. The design on this part's an interesting take, too. As a kid, this final form definitely creeped me out, and it still kinda does, actually, but Dracula's supposed to be really handsome, so I think this is like a Ron Howard, Clint Howard situation.
Boom. Roasted.
When you do finally beat him and the game ends, you see Dracula's castle crumble to pieces while the credits roll. This part's really interesting because it's the only time the game gets a little cheeky and breaks the 4th wall. If you read the credits carefully, you'll see names like Bram Stoker, Christopher B., and Boris Karloff's, all of which are parodies of actual people behind the horror classics like Bram Stoker, Christopher Lee, and Boris Karloff. I'm not mad. Everyone likes a little nod to the geeks. So I think we've learned something today. Lots of good games have interesting environments, or a good soundtrack, or a fantastic storyline that keep things entertaining, but it's pretty rare for a game to have all that at once. The first Castlevania had a great gameplay experience, really interesting level design, a ton of enemy and boss variation, and memorable, well-written music that never gets repetitive. There's even a satisfying ending. It's hard to ask for much more than that, and that, my friends, is what makes Castlevania so damn special. Thanks for watching. See you next time.